Welcome, everyone. Uh, Thank you all so much for joining. I'm really excited for today's conversation. I am Carolyn Shaughnessy. I am the Director of Network Engagement at the Social Innovation Forum. To begin, I'm going to share some brief Zoom meeting reminders. So it's hard to imagine that folks need them, but out of habit, I'm going to share them. First, closed captioning is available. You'll see that live transcript CC at the bottom of your screen. If you hit it, the words will start to come up at the bottom of your screen. So please feel free to use that. We also encourage folks throughout the session to engage in the chat. Comments are welcome, but we're particularly interested in your questions, and we're going to try to get to those as we go through the session, but we also have a Q&A later in the session to get to any we don't cover during. So we're recording the session, which some of you might have heard as we come in, and that will be available just a couple days after the event. And then just a reminder to turn on speaker view and to keep yourself muted during the speaking portion of the event. Okay, so we can move on to our agenda. So when I'm done with my very brief introduction, I'm going to have the honor of passing this session off to Shadi Salehi, the Director of the Trust-Based Philanthropy Project. She's going to give an overview of the project and the trust-based philanthropy values and practices. We're then going to jump into our conversation with John Brothers, the president of the T. Rowe Price Foundation, and Carrie Avery, the president of the Durfee Foundation. As I mentioned, please feel free to put questions in the chat. We're going to be keeping an eye on that chat, and we'll get to as many as we can. And then we're going to have a few minutes at the end for just a closing reflection and to really be action-oriented and intentional in our next steps today. So I want to pull up SIF's visual model, which many of you have seen, but I want to talk about it in the context of today's conversation. So on the purple side of our model, you'll see the nonprofits we work with in our capacity building programs. We work through our accelerator, capacity camps, and alumni programming to help community-led nonprofits with leadership skills, technical skills, and building a network. We know that our incredibly hardworking nonprofit leaders can't do this work alone. So we're also working with folks on the green side of this model. And for today, that's specifically our funder community. And we're asking you to do the hard work required to strengthen the social sector and address the systemic inequities in the way money is both accumulated and allocated. From the perspective of SAF, at the heart of this change is the connection and relationships built on trust and transparency. In the model that you're looking at, SIF is the cog in the middle, and that represents our efforts to provide opportunities for those connections to happen. But just meeting one another isn't enough. As we know, philanthropy has perpetuated many of the inequities that put historically marginalized communities at a greater disadvantage. So we need to be intentional in identifying our contributions to an unequal system and intentional in redistributing power in a more equitable way. So speaking of intentionality, I hope many of you had a chance to look at the self-assessment that we sent last week. If you didn't or you didn't get it for some reason, that is okay. We can share that link in the chat. As I mentioned in my email about the self-assessment tool that came from the Trust-Based Philanthropy Project, it's nothing you need to share today, but it's offered instead as an opportunity to be intentional, to see where your organization's strengths are and where the gaps are, so you can clearly identify areas to improve. Again, for those of you who haven't seen it or jumped in, we will get it in the chat. I'm so pleased to have the team from the Trust-Based Philanthropy Project here to speak with us today about their intentional approach to address power and build equity in philanthropy. Shadi Salehi is a strategist, facilitator, and network builder who has dedicated nearly 2 decades to the nonprofit sector. She currently serves as the director of the Trust-Based Philanthropy Project, a learning and advocacy initiative to make trust-based practices the norm in the philanthropic sector. She's also the principal and founder of Skyview Strategies, a social impact consultancy for nonprofits, foundations, and change makers. So Shadi, I'm going to turn this over to you to tell us about the Trust-Based Philanthropy Project.
Thank you, Carolyn, and it's so wonderful to be with you all today. I'm calling in from San Francisco, where it is very cold and foggy, and the heat is currently on, just to give you a sense of how dramatically different it is on this side of the country. Really delighted to be with you all. As Carolyn mentioned, I'm the director of the Trust-Based Philanthropy Project. We are a 5-year advocacy initiative that was launched in January 2020 to make trust-based practices the norm in our sector. So I'll be describing a little bit more about what that all is, and I'll be pleased to bring in my colleagues, Carrie Avery and Sean Brothers, to speak about their leadership in this space. But first and foremost, Carolyn mentioned that, that self-reflection tool. Just to see a show of hands, you can either use the little hand emoji on the bottom of your screen, or you can literally raise your hand if you're on video. How many of you had a chance to just take a glance at that self-reflection tool? Wonderful, okay. Seeing some hands. Hopefully after today's discussion, you'll have a lot more context on what that all is. We'll be speaking about those 4 dimensions. So really great to see that some of you have done some of that pre-homework, and we'll be sharing a little bit more about that as well. So before we jump in, let's do a poll just to get a sense of who's in the room. Where along the trust-based journey is your organization currently? And this is totally anonymous, so you can answer as honestly as you can. But just to get a sense, are you kind of at this, really beginning stages, not yet engaged on these ideas, but hoping to? Are you starting to explore? Are you further along on the journey? Just want to get a sense, and we'll give folks about a minute or so to reflect and choose your answer, and then we'll share that back out with the group.
So as of now, it looks like about 10% of our attendees are at the 1 stage. About 33% of our attendees are in the early stage. 29% are in the mid stage. So that's like practicing some, but not fully widespread. 19% are in the mid to late stage, and a good 10% are in the advanced stage.
Excellent. Thank you, Aditi.
Yeah.
Great. So we've got kind of a bell curve. That's usually what the responses look like. So wonderful. We've got a good mix of perspectives. So we invite you to share questions in the chat, even insights of your own practice. If you'd like to contribute, there's a lot of collective wisdom in the room. So please feel free to share any insights or questions along the way during the discussion. Thank you. All right, well, let's jump into it. Aditi, if you can kick off those slides, please. Excellent. So first, I want to kind of start out and describe what is the problem that trust-based philanthropy seeks to address. And fundamentally, if you look at it, philanthropy has a lot of positive intentions, a lot of positive values, a lot of positive goals around equity, fairness, advancing opportunity. But what has happened in our sector is that our practices, our systems, our ways of actually doing the work have created a fundamental gap between those very positive intention values and the way we actually show up in the work. So part of what we're here to address is that we have kind of created all these barriers, sometimes unintentionally, sometimes just kind of leaning on the way things have always been done, that have actually gotten in the way of the very positive intention values that philanthropy has in this sector. So that's fundamentally what we're here to address. Next slide, please. So let's put some numbers to why and how we see some of these gaps appearing. This is some research that was conducted by the Open Road Alliance, which is an organization that is committed to supporting and catalyzing impact-oriented projects by nonprofits around the country. A couple of years ago, they did an analysis, a survey of all of their various grant recipients to get a sense of what are the things that have gotten in the way of your ability to achieve the impact that you set out to achieve. And based on a set of open-ended responses, meaning this was not like a multiple choice, check the box, which of these things below led to barriers to you achieving your success, open-ended response analysis revealed that nearly 50% of the barriers that got in the way of nonprofits achieving their intended impact were funder created obstacles. And you can see kind of the breakdown in detail there of what was it that came about that became a hindrance and a barrier to these organizations achieving their impact. I should note that this data is based on a specific subset of organizations, but what it does reveal is that we are often unaware of the things that we're doing that are getting in the way of nonprofits doing their best work. So this kind of highlights that values to practice gap that that I'm talking about. But we have ways that we can actually address that and do something about it. So next slide, please. So this is the definition of trust-based philanthropy. It inherently addresses that inherent power imbalance that exists between funders, nonprofits, and the communities that they serve. So I want to start there and just allow you some space to reflect on that. Fundamentally, there is a power imbalance between funders and nonprofits. Funders get to allocate the resources, determine where they go, and often inform how they are actually used and leveraged to support the nonprofit's work. Nonprofits need those resources in order to do their work. There is fundamentally a power imbalance there. And then when you layer on these other factors of race and gender and other factors, there's even more heightened power imbalance if you look at it in a systemic context. So what we're talking about here is about redistributing power on a systemic level, organizationally and interpersonally, in service of a healthier and more equitable nonprofit ecosystem. So if we want nonprofits to be successful in their work and achieve what they're setting out to do and achieve the impact and the innovation that we all would love to see, then this requires a real awareness of how power is showing up in these relationships and how it's hindering that impact. On a practical level, we'll talk about these practices that we can actually leverage and deploy in order to alleviate some of that power imbalance, but then also building relationships that are centered on transparency, dialogue, and mutual learning so that we can, again, continue to chip away at that power dynamic. Next slide, please. So it is important to recognize that trust-based philanthropy exists within an ecosystem. What we mean by that is that, even though we're talking a lot about the funder-grantee relationship, all of this work exists in a greater ecosystem wherein there's relationships between organizations and individuals and all of that kind of coming together toward the work that's happening on a greater scale. When you think about this work within an ecosystem, relationships become that kind of that social currency that we use in order to do the work. So centering relationship in all this work is one of the key values of what we're talking about here. And even though there are many different embodiments of trust-based philanthropy, and it looks different for different organizations, the core of the work is this values-based approach of leading with trust rather than distrust, centering relationships, approaching this work with collaboration, humility, and curiosity. Having a commitment to redistributing power, because when we hoard power within the hands of a few, then we're not actually able to achieve this bigger picture impact that we want to achieve. And then ultimately a value of working towards systemic equity. So much of the work that various foundations and philanthropists are hoping to address are about addressing those systemic inequities. So we have to center an awareness of that and how power shows up systemically. Next slide, please. The other thing to remember, and this is a reference to that self-reflection tool that you may have looked at. There are 4 dimensions to this work. A lot of times trust-based philanthropy is referred to in terms of the grant-making practices. These are some of the most practical, tangible ways that we can address those power imbalances that we're talking about. That being said, there's kind of these other foundational elements in a trust-based approach that are kind of essential ingredients for the work to be done well. And this is what we call the 4 dimensions of trust-based philanthropy. It's your values, it's your culture, it's your leadership, and it's your practices. So it's really the alignment of these 4 dimensions that allows us to fully express and embody a trust-based approach. And what this means is that if we don't do the investment work in thinking about our values and how they are driving the attitudes, priorities, and actions of our organizations, and if we're not doing that work on just the culture of an organization and building trust internally, and if leadership isn't taking the responsibility of upholding and reinforcing those values and culture, then our practices will not ever be fully trust-based. So what this means is that reflection about power that we talk about and we think about in our grant-making work also applies to the way we look at our organizations and the way our organizations operate. So this is a lot of the kind of behind the scenes work. It requires a lot of self-reflection and dialogue internally. Hopefully we'll be able to speak to some of that with our speakers today. But this also means how staff and board work together needs to be committed to building trust and dialogue. So as we talk through these practices, just remember there are kind of these fundamental kind of internal elements that are key to the practice. So what this means is that an organization can be out there practicing all the trust-based practices in terms of their grant making, but if there's not trust built internally, then at some point that trust is going to break down externally. So we'll speak to some of that in a moment, but I just wanted to kind of underscore that this is why that self-reflection tool really does go through those four dimensions. And it illuminates different ways you can think about how trust shows up on those four dimensions. So we'll encourage you to check that out again after this conversation. Next slide, please. And so when we think about the grant making practices, there are 6 key practices that we advocate for. These are not the only ones. You'll hear other examples and they kind of have different manifestations in different organizations. But these are the core practices that are intentional ways of building trust, centering relationship, and redistributing power in that funder-grantee relationship. So first and foremost, it's giving multi-year unrestricted funding. What that recognizes is that the work that nonprofits do is long-term and it's unpredictable. And if we ever had any doubt about that, the last 18 months have really shown us this, where there are kind of unpredictable things that happen and that plans that were set 2 years ahead of time were no longer relevant because the dynamics and the nature of our society and our communities was rapidly evolving in the midst of a pandemic. So what better way to signal trust, and what better way to signal an awareness of the unpredictability of our world than to give multi-year unrestricted funding? The second practice is doing the homework. This recognizes and puts the onus of due diligence on funders. It recognizes a lot of the barriers that have been put in place for nonprofits, all the pre-work that they need to do just to be considered to submit a proposal. So what are some ways that funders can kind of take on some of that onus, both in getting to know the particular issue area or region that they're funding in, and also to get to know the prospective grantee community that is out there and pushing beyond our usual circles to kind of identify those that may not be making it on the radar, and look beyond kind of those traditional organizations that are able to get their foot in the door more easily. Related to that is a commitment to simplifying and streamlining paperwork. There is a lot of data out there about how much proposals and reports require of nonprofit leaders. Some proposals and reports can take upwards of 40 hours a week to complete. That's a full work week. And so if you imagine that being that time that could be going to the work, but rather going to proposal writing and reporting. And then you imagine all the stuff that is submitted and does it even get read or reviewed by prospective funders? So how can we rethink our paperwork processes so that we can break down some of those transactional walls and create more opportunity for dialogue and connection and different ways of getting to know organizations' work. And oftentimes those transactional walls actually get in the way of getting the real information of what's happening or what those organizations are doing. So how can we rethink that? And then the final 3 practices, being transparent and responsive, soliciting and acting on feedback, and offering support beyond the check, are a lot about how we show up in these relationships. And again, in transparency, being open about where the money is coming from that you're giving out, being open about how your strategies are evolving at your organization, and being responsive to nonprofits when they are reaching out for inquiries or just reaching out with updates about their work. Being able to reciprocate that type of a responsive relationship goes a long way in building trust over time. Soliciting and acting on feedback also recognizes that nonprofits and community leaders have a lot of expertise and wisdom that can inform the way we operate as funders. It recognizes their experiences and their experiences not just as grant recipients, but their lived experience in the communities that are being served to inform the way we see our work as funders. And then finally, offering support beyond the check is this notion that we have a lot more to bring to the table than dollars alone. Of course, the financial resources are key in supporting the work of nonprofits, but there's so much more that we can bring to the table. And really in a way of building that kind of relational approach. And there's many ways of offering that support beyond the check. that can really go a long way in advancing the kind of well-being and the success of these organizations. So that's a very quick overview of the trust-based kind of purpose, the values and the practices, but hopefully that'll give us some grounding for our discussion with our speakers. And we can take it off slides so that we can go into a conversation. So I am very pleased to introduce my two colleagues today, and just a few things to underscore. Trust-based philanthropy does not have a one-size-fits-all approach. It looks different for different organizations, and it varies depending on your issue focus, your regional focus, the type of foundation, your asset size. But what you'll hear today, the core elements of this work are these values that are of power sharing and equity. And I invite you to listen for those values in the discussion. So today we're going to hear from two foundation leaders representing two different perspectives. We've got Carrie Avery, president of the Durfee Foundation, family foundation, place-based funding in Los Angeles. And we've also got John Brothers, who's president of the T. Rowe Price Foundation, also a place-based foundation, a corporate funder funding in Baltimore. So I would love to invite you, Carrie, first to share just a little bit about Durfee Foundation and why has trust-based philanthropy become such a central way that you have approached your work over the last couple decades?
Sure, thank you, Shadi. So the Durfee Foundation has been around for a long time. We were founded in 1960 in Los Angeles. And while I don't think that we were a trust-based funder from the get-go, I would say that we've been practicing trust-based philanthropy before the term trust-based philanthropy was coined, and for several decades now. And we are, as Shadi said, we're based in Los Angeles. We focus on LA County. We are issue agnostic. We fund across all issues. We're focused on people who make change in Los Angeles. And so we have several signature programs. I'll talk about a couple of them here. One is our Springboard program that supports younger organizations, gives them multi-year general operating support. We also have a sabbatical program that is for nonprofit leaders who've been in it for a while. We give them, their organization, a grant to allow the leader to take a 3-month break from work and totally disconnect. And there's a lot of support for the rest of the organization to allow them to the rest of the team to step up. And it's pretty transformative for the organization. We also have a lot of other stuff going on. I encourage you to look at the durfee.org website. Just to give you a little sense of, we give away a little over $2 million a year, so we're not huge. We have 4 staff. So sometimes people say, oh, I can't do trust-based philanthropy because we need more people. We do it that way. And it's really about how you approach it and how you approach the work overall. And I would also say that, we practice trust-based philanthropy not because it's the cool thing to do or it's because it's virtue signaling, but it's a more impactful way to operate. It brings you closer to the people who are actually doing the work, and allows you to be in a learning mindset, which is a big value at the Durfee Foundation. Make changes, iterate all the time. And we found it really helpful for us since Trust-Based Philanthropy Project got launched. It provides this really useful framework for us at the foundation, even though I said we've been operating this way, just sort of making it up as we went along. But now that there's trust-based philanthropy and there's this whole community of people that we're working with, we're able to check in about all aspects of our operations and have this way to think, are we operating truly in a trust-based way across, our grant making, across our operations, across our staffing, and work with our vendors in every way. So it's been really, really helpful for us to have this community to work with. And I'll stop there and turn it over to John.
Thank you, Carrie. John, take it away.
Thanks, Carrie. Thanks, Shadi. Well, thanks everybody for having me. My name is John Brothers, and I lead the philanthropy for T. Rowe Price. We both have a donor advised fund, and we have the philanthropic arm of the firm. Our philanthropic arm of the firm, which has around 8 staff members, gives away around 15 million a year, with a good chunk of that going to matching gift, but a majority of it going towards direct giving. So I guess I would say, similar to Carrie, we've been practicing what is now called trust-based philanthropy for not as long as Durfee, but since the unrest began here in Baltimore in 2015. Most corporate philanthropy is what FSG has called confetti style funding. We certainly practice that style of funding for a majority of the time, where we wanted to spread our philanthropy kind of far and wide and go an inch deep. And after the unrest here in 2015, and that actually coincided with my first week in Baltimore, started to kind of spend a lot of time just in the basements of churches and in the backs of community centers and the living rooms of residents, just trying to listen to what was important to them and what where they wanted their own self-determinations to go. And what we heard, and you saw this in the presentation that Shadi gave, was a lot of the discussion that the challenges they were having was about the bedside manner of philanthropy, and how not only we, but also the public side showed up in their community over decades and decades. And for us, well, instantly, I was a former community organizer. And so for me, a lot of those past experiences came to the forefront, and we started to really think about our bedside manner, where we had walked into community in a challenged way, and how we had to do a lot of work in a number of areas, racial equity and racial justice, but also in the practices of how we did our work, and ultimately did a number of different things to kind of change how we showed up in community. We have a number of different funds and a number of different initiatives. Companies have more than direct giving when they show up in community. And so we spend a lot of time trying to figure out how you can use the infrastructure and all the nooks and crannies of a global financial services firm in community, but also led by community. And so we never are in front of anybody in their neighborhoods. And our job is to try to figure out, what Baltimore lacks, where we do a majority of our funding, is a lot of infrastructure. And that's what we have as a company. And so we figure out how not only do we use our financial assets, but other different aspects of our corporate apparatus to benefit and be led by community to create more impactful social change at the community level. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you both, Carrie and John. So let's dig into it a bit. There's this misperception that trust-based philanthropy is just about writing a check and walking away. But as both Carrie and John have described, it's so much more than that. And Carrie, I just want to turn to you. Can you share more about the nuances and rigors of a trust-based and relational approach in trust-based philanthropy?
Yeah, so I'll go to our Springboard program for newer organizations as an example. So an earlier iteration of that program, we used to give general operating support to new organizations, and then just and kind of do that, just sort of give them money and step out of the way. But then after a few years of that, we noticed that there were some organizations who were really doing well and others who hadn't, and we brought together the organizations who had done really well, working with community and growing. And we said, how could we make this program work better for future organizations, for you and for others? And by listening to them, we redesigned the program, which is now Springboard, and it's a much better program. We give bigger grants. We stick with fewer organizations for a longer period of time. So instead of giving a lot of money to a whole bunch of organizations, we're being more selective, working with fewer organizations and sticking with them. We also put in another feature, which is that based on the feedback that we got from these community leaders, was that they all said, I didn't know what I didn't know when I was building my organization. And it wasn't, and I really needed somebody to help show me along the way. So we pair them with a mentor now who's an alum of our sabbatical program, a seasoned nonprofit leader, and we pay that person an hourly fee and to work closely with them for 50 hours a year. And that way they have somebody that they know that they can call. They're not asking them to do them a favor. They're being paid for their time, but they develop a really close relationship and help them with, how do you build a board? How do you fundraise? How do you do all of the things that most people starting an organization don't know, because they get into it because they're passionate about the issue, but they don't know all of the other stuff that goes into building an organization. And so we try to create an environment where the goal is to break down the barriers that make nonprofits think that the only time that they can talk to us at the foundation is if they're reporting on their grant progress. And instead, it's like, we also want to be your thought partner. We have you have your mentor to work with, but also we check in with you. And so we've done away with written grant reports. We have people, we call them, we set up a phone call, and we just do an oral report and ask some questions, and find that that's a much deeper process than for them to respond to a number of questions and give us what they think that they want us to hear.
Thank you, Carrie. There's so much embedded in that I want to lift up. First of all, even the design of the Springboard Fund was informed by grantees and past grantees and prospective grantees. So that's an example of soliciting feedback and actually acting on it and rethinking the structure of the grant program based on the experience of those who've been through it. And then there's the support beyond the check of like pairing new grantees, emerging organizations with a mentor, and then also kind of offering that thought partnership. And all of those things are ways of building a deeper relationship. And then that streamlined paperwork. You heard that in the verbal reporting, which is not even really formal reporting. It's actually getting to know the work, getting to know the organization, and then making that multi-year commitment allows for you and your team, Carrie, to really understand how these organizations are faring over time, rather than just floating in with a one-year grant and stepping out. And there was a question in the chat I noticed that was about, would a trust-based approach advocate for funding staff positions, just helping an organization build its staff? Yes, 100%. When we say unrestricted, that is truly unrestricted. And so that allows nonprofit leaders to allocate and determine how they want to spend those funds, how they can plan ahead. So there's just so much, so much good stuff baked in what you described, Carrie. And you also alluded to this in your intro, that you get a lot out of this as funders. So I'm just curious, at the Durfee Foundation, you as a team and a board, what do you get out of really kind of deploying this type of relational and trust-based approach?
Well, it's hard for me to say, because I really can't imagine doing it any other way. Sometimes when I talk to some people who are program officers at foundations, and frankly, their jobs sound like kind of a grind, where they're in this endless loop of reporting and checking on people, and a lot of paperwork and dockets. And instead, it feels like we're in a place where we're always learning and iterating and making connections, and it's fun. It's, we're in these a whole bunch of relationships with nonprofit leaders who are really cool people, and it also makes us better at what we do, because we're in close contact with them, and we're always open to changing the way that we do things, and that's much more fun and exciting than just operating on a bunch of deadlines. I was also, there was something in the chat about, other examples of support beyond the check. And another one that we do, especially with our Springboard organizations, is introducing them to other funders. And we do a lot of that. We're sort of known in LA as, if someone gets a Springboard grant from Durfee, they know that we have done the due diligence. They know that they're a solid organization that's really connected to the community, and but we also take it further by taking pains to introduce them to funders and try to do some matchmaking that way as well.
That's so key. That is such a key way of offering support beyond the check, especially, I'll say, for people of color-led organizations, emerging organizations that just don't have that kind of seat at the power table, don't have those access, those connections, that access. That is so key and goes such a long way. So next, I want to turn to you, John. You've alluded to some of this already, that a lot of the rigor and strategy of a trust-based approach is about listening to community. That was one of the first things that you did when you stepped into your role. And then doing the homework to kind of hear from the community to inform your grant making. So can you share more about how T. Rowe Price has done this, how you're continuing to do this, and everything, and all of your approaches at the foundation?
Yeah, so I would say, we're now several years into, the way we do our philanthropy. And again, to Carrie's point, I couldn't imagine doing it any other way, right? I think philanthropy has to realize that its role in being a part of meaningful social change is behind the scenes, that we are led to community's own North Stars. And that's not how philanthropy has practiced. And so I think for us, there's a lot of work that we need to do as a sector to try to reposition where we belong in the solutions around meaningful social change. And so for us, on the listening side to your question, we are now at a place of just making sure, number one, before we walk into community, we have done what we call pre-listening, right? And that is walking into community with a pretty good understanding of some essential truths. One is that philanthropy can be a great power for good, but that we have done damage in community. We are, as a group, part of a sector that has done damage, and that we as a foundation on behalf of a company may have done damage as well. In fact, we have accountability partners that push their thumb in our side pretty deeply when we don't come correct in community, and that's important. That we don't look at communities as needs to be solved, right? No community solution has ever been solved by saying, wow, there's a lot of broken stuff there, let's put that together. No one wants to be referred that way, and no solutions can be worked on with that kind of mentality. And so to view community as needs to be solved as rather as assets to be cultivated is something that's a universal truth for us before we walk into community, and that community is the boss, right? Their members, their designees, their organizations are in charge, and our job is to figure out how do we support them, understanding that their North Star, their self-determination is everything, and our job is to support that. And that's sometimes, and I think I'm not going to put words in Carrie's mouth, but it's probably in some of those conversations with program officers, their approach to community is the opposite, right? And so for us, our job is to make sure that we are always walking the path that community allows us the privilege to be a part of. And that's really important. If that happens and we're able to walk in community in the right way, listening for sure. And oftentimes listening, we think, is sitting down one-on-ones or in community meetings and using our ears, and that's certainly true, but it's also using our eyes. And so understanding service delivery at the ground level. So all of myself and my team, we pay attention to how service delivery happens on the ground. That's an important way to understand how things happen in community. If you're sitting in a social service office and they use an intake form that's 28 pages long, which happens in Baltimore and lots of different places, that says a lot about the ecosystem and its approach to local community and what they think and practice in local community. And so for us, it's important for us as part of the listening process to understand at the local level how folks interact with systems and structures so that we can understand how we relate to that, can advocate for better structures with our partners and other types of things. And so all of that is wrapped up in the listening process. And Shadi, we have never kind of talked about the non-ear listening, right? Or the pre-listening, but a lot of listening is also just paying attention to the wavelengths and how folks in community interact with structures that we have created, often structures that are structurally racist, that make it difficult for community members to be able to do the things that we do, right? So when we look at our own practice, which some of them relate to the 6 that you've seen, right? Like what is the bedside manner of our application process, and how does that interact with also the ecosystem of stuff that they come into contact with? All of that is really intentional, and there's real purpose behind that. And so trust-based philanthropy is not 6 things that you checkbox off. It's an ongoing muscle that, quite frankly, you're never going to do 100% well. It's a marathon, not a race. And so the last thing I would say is that I've done a number of these conversations. It's a real privilege to do it. Sometimes folks are like, well, if I do the 6, then I'm a trust-based philanthropy, right? That's just a starting point for you to, on an ongoing basis, make sure that you're knocking down barriers that allow you to inherently see eye to eye with your community members and be led by them.
Thank you, John. There's so much there. I think, one of the undercurrents that I hope you all are picking up on is the power awareness in all aspects of the work. So approaching the work with the pre-listening, that requires a sense of humility, and it recognizes inherently that the wisdom exists in the community. I'd love to hear, John, what does T. Rowe Price Foundation get out of this? Because some people might hear this and say, that sounds like a lot of pre-work before even doing a grant. It sounds like a lot of kind of going back and listening. Like, how do you justify putting the time and investment in this kind of relational listening, learning approach?
Yeah, I mean, again, for us, we can't think about it any other way. And what we know is there's a number of common denominators that for us are similar to our community partners. Number one, we want to see community get to a better place. I mean, that's equal, right? And in fact, at the community level, much might be strong. It might be probably is stronger than us. It's their neighborhood, their communities. And for us, we can't be an active participant or a player in meaningful social change in their communities if we hold things that cause us to walk into that community in difficult ways, right? So if I walk into a community using the words of impact and scale, which quite frankly have been damaging words that philanthropy have used at the community level, if we walk in and say, hey, we want you to measure a lot of stuff, we want you to step on this scale in your home, and we're going to move furniture around because we say we want to do that. There's no way that I could be part of community change with those dynamics at play, right? And so for us, there's just no way that we can meaningfully be involved in changing community or having community want to get to the places that they want to get to if we hold these things that prevent us from really listening, really partnering, really locking arms. And there's a number of day-to-day practices that prevent philanthropy from doing that. And it's probably why many of these solutions as it relates to philanthropy are not working, right? It's the how of philanthropy that's as important, if not more important, than the programs or the finances that we give. It's the way we show up, right? If you were at the bar at 5 o'clock with nonprofits and they're complaining about philanthropy, they're often not complaining about the amount, they're complaining about the way we showed up and the way that they were treated. And you just can't get to change if that's the leading challenges. And so think about true partnership, think about marriage and how you connect with community and what are the things that prevent that. And that should be your goal day in and day out. Ultimately, if you do that well, you probably are going to get to some of the change that both of you seek.
Wow, thanks, John. We're getting so many questions. We're going to be getting to a few of these in a moment, some questions about the accountability partners. I want to underscore one thing. So many of our systems and philanthropy have set it up so that nonprofits are accountable to the funders. And that distracts nonprofits from actually doing the work and being accountable to the communities that they serve. So we really need to be intentional about that. So that we cannot overemphasize that point. I do want to move on to racial equity, because we cannot address power without talking about race. And we are getting some good questions that are kind of related to this. Carrie, I want to turn to you. You lead a family foundation. You've done a lot of intentional work at your family foundation to embed racial equity values in your work, including at the governance level, looking at your governance structure, and then also looking at your staffing and your grant making portfolio. So that's a lot of layers. We're already getting some questions around board dynamics and board structure. Can you speak more to how Durfee is intentionally embedding racial equity values across all layers of your work?
Sure. And I also say, Durfee, we are not at the front of the pack here. And we're working on it, but I am very conscious that my friend Kelly Nolan from the Cerna Foundation is in the audience, and they're light years ahead of where we are, but I'll still talk about where we are. And race equity, the work on race equity it's very much intertwined with the trust-based philanthropy work. I mean, in fact, trust-based philanthropy puts race equity at the center of how we operate. And some of the ways that we're doing this is, so we have non-family trustees on our board. It took us 50 years. It was at our 50th anniversary in 2010 that the board voted to add non-family community trustees, and we recruit people who are former grantees or folks in philanthropy, and very much, one of our goals is to diversify our otherwise white family board. And we're also really careful with our community trustees not to put the labor of educating the board about race and race equity on their shoulders. We're not looking to them to, oh, please, you're the ones who have to do this. We're all in this together, and we're very conscious of not putting on them, although we very much want to involve them in their viewpoints. We've long had a practice of, we have selection panels for our grant program. So like for the sabbatical program, people apply, we have an interview process, and we populate the selection panels with alums from the sabbatical program. So there will always be 3 alums, and we select them also for race diversity, and also they just bring so much of a trust-based approach to how we make decisions and how we inform our decisions. We're very conscious about race when in our staff, even though I said we have a staff of 4, so we're small, we don't have a lot to work with, but it's something that we think about a lot. And in our succession planning, we have, there are 2 senior leaders who've been there for a long time. I am one of them. We're both white women. We've created succession plans that are, that call out that we expect and hope that the board will replace us with people of color when in the next few years. We look at our professional and vendor relationships. We've made changes to our investment advisors, our auditors, our CPA is Latino. We use a photographer for a lot of our events and gift our grantees with professional portraits of themselves, which is really useful for them. Our former photographer that we worked with for 20 years, he retired. We just signed a contract with the Black photographer, and he's and we're delighted about that. So it's so interesting doing this race equity work, because it feels like you get at one level, like you look at who are we making grants to, and that's one level, and that's really important. But then there are all these other levels at governance and operations and board learning, which is also something that we're doing together, sharing resources, setting aside time for discussions at meetings, and telling the board that, that this is not something that we just put on the agenda one time and read a book together and that's it. We're putting this on the agenda every time, and we're going to be talking about it all the time in all the different layers that we discover.
Thank you, Carrie. A couple things to highlight here. As Carrie mentions, as many of you all know, racial equity work is a journey, as well as trust-based philanthropy. So these are ongoing processes, and you heard in the way Carrie is describing, it's a kind of constant reexamination, constant kind of self-interrogation to kind of really continue to push forward. Really appreciate you sharing all those various levels, Carrie. John, you've already kind of alluded to some of this, as a foundation in a city with its own history of racial reckoning. We've also heard from many foundations that are actually, foundation leaders that are using trust-based philanthropy as a way to bring boards along in the racial equity journey, because you can't build trust without really embodying racial equity values. So I'm curious, John, from your standpoint, how do you see the connection between trust and racial equity when it comes to philanthropy?
Yeah, I think I have a pretty interesting story. After 2015, we developed what we call our theory of philanthropy. At the time, there wasn't a trust-based philanthropy kind of movement. And so we developed 9 principles to our work there, and started to practice that in 2016. And all of a sudden got a number of folks within the Baltimore community to say, well, that's a philanthropy that gets it. And we want them to lead conversations on racial equity and racial justice, like equating the practice that we had with also, hey, they seem to be a woke philanthropy. They should be leading discussions. And for me, and I'll just speak about myself, anytime I was approached by a kind of Black leader in the city about talking about philanthropy and racial justice, in the beginning, I said, yes, I'd be happy to do it. And for me, I felt like it was an honor to be able to do that. What I quickly realized is my history of talking about racial justice was much in the vein of cultural competency and not in racial justice and racial equity. And I realized pretty early on that we weren't qualified to talk about any of those things. And in fact, we hadn't done the work needed to understand structural racism, white supremacy in the way that we needed to. And so for myself and my team, we embedded ourselves in, we were asked and we said, listen, we're not the people that should be talking about this, because we've got work to do on ourselves, and my board has work to do on themselves to be able to kind of, at a minimum level, understand the language of structural racism, understand white supremacy, and be able to talk about them in a way that related to us as compared to being, whatever, a quote unquote woke philanthropy leader. And so we worked a long time kind of understanding how ourselves individually and as a foundation related to that work. And that's where we started to develop accountability partners in community that we didn't ask them, hey, will you be our accountability partner, right? Like there's no list of the senior accountability partners for the T. Rowe Price Foundation, but we have a list of leaders, we don't have a list, but we have a number of leaders in community that accept that a role of pushing their thumb in our side, and we hold really close. We have 4 to 6 meetings with these individuals yearly to talk on both sides about our practice and what we're doing, and they push their thumbs in our side really hard when they feel, again, that we're not coming correct. But that only could have been done in 2 ways. One is that we did our own work, and number 2, that they felt trust with us to be able to have some of those difficult conversations. And we have consistent challenges about how much do we step out to press our peers in this work, right? That's an ongoing discussion that, they want us to really step out. We have a group of Black activist organizations that want us to write something in the local paper on some areas. And, obviously as a global corporate financial services firm, we're weighing that and trying to figure that out. And so there's a lot of back and forth, and it's not pretty, and it's difficult on an ongoing basis. But what we can say is that we have operationalized and consistently operationalized racial equity principles in the work that we do. We have partners that we trust that work with us on that. And we know this is not comfortable. And at any point in time, if we're like, we got it, we know we don't have it. And so we feel confident all the time that there's a feeling in the pit of our stomach that we're not comfortable with. And that is a driving force in how we approach racial equity on a daily basis.
Thank you, John. I think some of that discomfort and some of that kind of that hard work really is such a core part of what trust-based philanthropy is. This is the work. We often think about just the grant making, but that behind the scenes, that kind of ongoing relationship building, self-checking, and pushing past uncomfortable conversations is part of that relational work. And it's a key part of what can make you a more responsive funder. We're getting a lot of questions about operationalizing some of these practices. So we will move to that in the Q&A, but there's 2 big themes that I want to address before we move to the formal Q&A portion of this. One is board relations. We are getting questions around how do you bring the board along in this journey? And Carrie, I want to turn to you, because when you were sharing your story about how you support grantee partners, what is the board's role in that? How have you brought your board along? How do you keep the board engaged without them necessarily getting in the weeds on grant decisions? What does that look like at Durfee Foundation?
Well, I feel really lucky. Our board, the Durfee board, is really awesome. And they have fully embraced this approach. And so I feel like I'm not necessarily the best person to talk about, how do you bring your board along, when I hear from people who have a board that's in a really different place. But the way that we've been bringing them along, I'll just use one example. We had an in-person board retreat, which was a thrill because it was the first time that we'd gotten together in more than a year, just a couple of weekends ago. And one of the things that we did was we brought together, we invited 4 of our Springboard organization leaders and their mentors. And we had sat them at 4 different tables and had 2 or 3 Durfee trustees sit at the table with them. And we gave them some questions, but we said, it's not a script. You can ask whatever questions you want. We started off in these small conversations with the Durfee board, asking questions of the leaders. What caused you to start this organization? What have been some of the bumps along the road? How has it been working with Durfee? But then after 20 minutes, we rang a bell and we flipped it. And the nonprofit leaders could ask questions of the Durfee board. It's like, what's it like to work with your family? Or if you're not one of the family members, what's it like to work with this family? And then we did 2 rounds of these conversations. We all had lunch together. It was, we just did a survey to find out what everybody thought about it, and people loved it, both the nonprofit leaders and the Durfee trustees. And so that was one example of a way to bring people along that's more than reading grant reports, that's more than having a nonprofit leader come in and present to the board, which is, that's a good step, but that's also one way, because it's, and it really is about this power sharing, that it's not just about us extracting information from the nonprofit. They need to know who we are and what we're about. And that's also part of, and not just from the staff level, but also from the board level. But when I talk to other boards about how to bring the board along, I really ask the board to explore their fears about operating in this way. So are you worried that grantees won't use the money properly, that they'll waste it? That's a problem. If those are your fears, then you aren't working with the right people, or you aren't working in the right way. It shouldn't be a grant contract and a lot of reporting requirements that cause nonprofits to do the right thing. If we find that if you extend trust, you get it back. And people often ask me, like, tell me some horror stories. When have things gone really wrong? When did, somebody embezzle all the money? We have none. There have been times when maybe we wished that an organization had done different things with the money, or we wondered if they made the right decisions, but we have no horror stories. But mostly it's been stories, the opposite, where it's like, wow, they took our money and other money, because we're obviously not their only funder, and they did way more than we thought was possible. And they did it in this creative way. And isn't it great that they did this because they knew what to do? We didn't know what they were supposed to be doing.
There's so much in there. And I actually want to do a follow-up question that's coming from the Q&A. And you were kind of alluding to this. How are you able to build the types of relationships wherein your partners feel comfortable sharing failures or hard lessons? How does that show up in the work?
It takes time. You can't just say, oh, we're trust-based, and tell us all your stuff, all your stuff. I mean, it's like a friendship or any kind of relationship. You have to show that that you mean it. And it's also about, sometimes leaning in with your relationship and leaning in with your funding, even when things are really tough. I think about, there's an organization called 1 in 6 that we funded for a very long time. We gave them startup funds. That it's working with adult male survivors of childhood sexual abuse. And their goal was really about changing, bringing that issue out of the closet. It was something that nobody wanted to talk about, really uncomfortable. And it took a long time to get off the ground. They're working with the US military, they're working with the NFL, they're doing all kinds of great work. But there were times when they were really struggling and they lost grants and they weren't achieving the goals that they had set for themselves. And we leaned in and gave them 3 more years of funding. And if we had stepped away from them, especially when you're dealing with the really hard stuff like that issue, they're not going to be able to accomplish everything in a 2 to 3 year grant time frame. And so Steve was, the founder, was able to come to us when he had some big setbacks and big disappointments. They were going to merge with another organization, and the merger, they put a huge amount of work into it. The merger fell through, and we were the first ones he called. So you have to be there.
Yeah. And I think that too is kind of getting at this impact question that a number of folks are already raising. And then also just the long-term nature of this work. It takes time. It was that multi-year investment that allowed you the space to even see this organization grow and evolve. The relationships that you built kind of, help make your grantee partner feel comfortable sharing. And that does take time. And some of those learnings are things that will never be captured in a written report. That comes from that relational dialogic approach to learning. And so this is this kind of constant theme of a learning mindset. John, you too really kind of have underscored this, like the constant learning of this work. And so just coming to you first, John, and reiterating that, a lot of damage has been done, as you have noted, by philanthropy. And a lot of that does get perpetuated in this kind of measurement push for nonprofits to have to measure and prove that they're achieving what they said that they were going to achieve, even when their work is very oftentimes long-term. So how do you at T. Rowe Price think about impact, measuring impact? How do you look at that? And how do you really embrace and embody a learning mindset with your partners?
So I think a couple of things that are important to us is that we want healthy and strong organizations before we want program outcomes, right? Because we know that strong community organizations at the community level are going to eventually lead to strong impact. And we know in Baltimore, our nonprofit sector, like a lot of Rust Belt cities, is really, really weak. And so for us, we are trying to build a community of strong organizations, and that includes them being strong learning organizations, wanting to learn for their sake. 70% of the nonprofit sector, like business, is mom and pops. They don't have R&D departments. They're not sitting back with they're using Excel charts. They're using whatever software they bought. And oftentimes they're measuring because of what philanthropy is asking them to measure, and not for their own self-determination. And if that is the reality, which likely it is, that's a problem. And so for us, we are not going to be measuring things for what we care about, right? And actually, working for a company, who, if you walk on the 7th floor of our headquarters, you're going to see all these Bloomberg terminals, right? And they're learning data every millisecond on the strength of the companies that they're investing in. But those companies are not doing that because they're measuring for their own value. That's the difference. We in the nonprofit sector are the only sector in which a lot of measuring is based on what we as philanthropy believes, instead of what they want to do and how they want to measure. And somehow, some way, we've got to reshift that balance where organizations are measuring for their own self-determination. They're not counting beans because of what they want us to do. And in large part, I remember the SSIR article that came out, I don't know, maybe 15 years ago now, called Drowning in Data. We as philanthropy aren't reading that data anyway, right? Like we are not strong learning organizations either, right? And so for us, we have developed an approach around evaluation that's centered on the idea that we want communities and the organizations that represent them to choose their own metrics and what they think is important. And if they need capacity building and reason, we do a lot of capacity building in a variety of different ways. And one of those is to work with them to help them figure out what do they think is important to them. And quite frankly, it's been really hard because they're used to philanthropy walking in their home, telling them to step on a scale and saying, well, you're only as valuable on that number as what we determine. And so there's a lot of trust-based work that has to say, no. You're in charge of where you want to go. We can give you structure if you need that to help you get there. And then we're going to lock arms, right? We have a dashboard that we've developed that we think is very trust-based focus and that they use to kind of do that. And the first time that they would report on that, they would put all greens. Look at how great we're doing. And we're like, listen, we know things aren't all green, right? Like you can trust, like we had to build trust for them to say, yeah, these areas are red. Here's the reasons why they're red. And the reason we wanted to know red wasn't for our trying to get them. We want to figure out other ways that we can support them. And if they list and are truthful about what's happening on the ground, we can figure out ways potentially to be supportive of that. And so we are now at a place in our communities where that dashboard and our process to how to do that work is sought out if you're a grantee or not. And we use a variety of different things to help them kind of figure out what their North Star is and how they march to their own beat. And then we use capacity building to help build that up for themselves so that they can be truly strong learning organizations that can advance their efforts for themselves, not for us. And that's a whole 3-hour discussion we can certainly get in on. But for us, it was a long way to get to that end. And a lot of that was the damage of, in philanthropy, the strategic philanthropy movement, or the words that we use around scale and all of that type of stuff, where at one point we thought that was awesome, right? And we were really smart when we entered the room because we were using those phrases and marching to those beats. But when we were doing that, we were actually causing damage in community. And so now we have to unravel that damage and recast the way we do this so that communities can start measuring for their own sake and not for ours.
Thank you, John. Before we move to the Q&A, I'd love to hear from you on this also, Carrie. And you at Durfee, you've also embodied this thing that some trust-based foundations deploy. It's kind of bringing the lens on yourselves, kind of looking at how well you're doing your own work and what's coming out of that. I know that's just one way that you look at your kind of how you look at impact and learning at Durfee, but could you comment on this question too, Carrie? How do you?
Sure. And yeah, I mean, just to add on to what John said, which was all terrific, I totally agree with it. But you know, some of what we do too, you know, there can be the mistaken notion that trust-based philanthropy is like, oh, we just give away money and we don't care what happens because we just trust it, it's all good. And it's not that fluffy. So in our sabbatical program for nonprofit leaders, a lot of what we're trying to do is create culture change within nonprofit organizations so that there isn't this this way of working people to death, burning them out, especially leaders with all that they carry, until they just quit in frustration, because the price of turnover in nonprofits is huge. And so we have done studies at the 7-year mark and the 20-year mark of our sabbatical program. This is something that we take on. You know, we hire the researchers, and they are, and all of this is up on our website, and we have very rigorous research about what is the impact of the sabbatical program on these organizations, and then also on the culture in Los Angeles generally. And it really has changed the culture, where when we launched this program almost 25 years ago, other funders thought that we were crazy, and they said, oh, you know, if you give these nonprofit leaders a break, they'll just quit and they'll leave. And so, you know, you can't, you have to keep them chained to their desks, because otherwise we'll lose them all, which was sad. And then there was also the other message that, well, if people take a sabbatical, that means that there's something wrong or they're on their way out. And now there really is an ethic in LA County of, if an organizational leader is taking a sabbatical, that means they are strong, they are awesome, that leader's been working hard, and he or she knows that they need to take a break for the strength of their organization. And it's a good thing. So that is the level of evaluation that we're doing. It's very rigorous, and we do care what happens to this money.
Thank you. That's great. So we have until about 25 after the hour for remaining questions. So I'd like to bring in some of the questions that we did not yet address that have already come through, but this is your time. If you have another question or a follow-up question, please put that in the chat. We will do our best to answer that. But I do want to go to this operationalizing piece. You know, there was one question early on about, what does it actually look like to streamline paperwork processes? What is that, like verbal reporting? What does that really look like? So I'm hoping that the two of you could briefly touch upon this. What does your application and reporting process look like? How has it been operationalized? I know it's hard to answer in just a minute or two, but John, why don't you start, and then we'll turn to you, Carrie.
So I'm a mega nerd in the processes behind philanthropy. I know, like, if you went home and said, I concentrated today on philanthropy processes, like, you would bore most people. But for me, I'm really excited about that. And so for us, we developed an approach in our application process that, one, allows grantees or prospective grantees to upload their best proposals. We ask 5 questions. None of them have need-based language, but it's all about how they partner in community. But then they also can access other resources. So it almost acts like a concierge service for them, even if they don't get the grant. So they're able to get and understand, kind of a report through a partner of what's going on in their community from a data perspective. They can access the impact genome through mission measurement in Chicago. They can they can sign up for capacity building services. And so for us, we've kind of recreated our application, number one, to be a better experience for them, to not have to do the things that they've had to do, but also be able to access services and resources, whether they get the grant or not. And what that does for us also is gives us additional data, that we can use. Part of our role is to see things from 10,000 degrees up. And so, in early 2022, we're going to release a report on the state of the sector in Baltimore and in a number of different areas. A lot of that data comes from that process, which, we're not doing behind the scenes or in a sneaky way. They have the ability to say, hey, we want you to have this data, or we don't want you to have this data, but it allows us to be able to provide service in a way that they like. They give us feedback every year on our process. So they help us lead that process, let us know where it's cumbersome or where it's annoying or where it doesn't make sense. But then also allows us to have data that we can use to kind of push our thumbs in the side of our other philanthropy leaders in the city to say, hey, maybe we should be thinking about this in a collaborative way or in other ways.
Thank you, John. And I do want to just make a plug for the Trust-Based Philanthropy website. We have a number of samples and templates of streamlined paperwork. We're going to continue to add to that. One of the samples we have is the Springboard Fund application from Durfee Foundation. So you can see kind of what is it like, how can it look like? What can you model? Also, I want to make a plug for accepting proposals written for other funders. That might not work for everyone, but that is something that some funders have deployed. That's a great way of just having something that you can reference that does generally give you some of that information that you would get in a formal process of your own. Carrie, anything to add or any insights to offer for those who are re-examining their application and reporting processes?
Yeah, so we start even before the application. We invite people through our website to call us before they apply and have a conversation, because sometimes, oftentimes somebody, they want to apply and they really aren't a fit. And we would much rather have a 10-minute conversation to figure that out than have them spend 4 hours writing an application and submitting it and having us review it and having to turn them down. So and again, we only have 4 staff, but we find that's a really good use of our time to be open in that way. On the other end too, we invite people who've been declined to call for feedback. So that's also part of the trust building process with community, even with people who aren't in our grantee group, because we just want to be transparent about what we do. We're always looking at our application and just to interrogate, are we asking, do we absolutely need everything that we're asking? What is the absolute minimum that we can ask for and still get the information that we need? And so, one thing that I know Robert Sterling Clark Foundation advocates is sit down and try to fill out your own application. And that can be a real eye-opening experience. It's like, wow, there's a lot of time-wasting questions here, or a lot of repetitive questions here. And we did that, and we found some. And so we were embarrassed, and we were able to edit and pare down to what was necessary. We do invite applications from other sources. We invite people, if they want to submit a video, a 2-minute video, we'll look at that, because sometimes, people have different ways of communicating better. So we really try to make it open to, just at the end of the day, you want to learn as much as you can about this organization, and you want to make it accessible to them so that they feel heard.
Those are such key points from both of you. And it also kind of merits an underscoring of the racial equity work that this can do, because so many of our processes and questions, and even the jargon that is used, it leaves out people who haven't had access to formal development training, haven't come up in the nonprofit industrial complex and know how to fluidly use, phrases like theory of change and impact metrics and all these things, and really kind of re-looking at those processes and taking a look at who is being left out of those processes, who's being alienated by some of this, who are we looking at all of this with an equity lens that can invite multiple leaders from all different backgrounds to enter into their process. We're getting another question around just that operationalizing of the multi-year grants. So I'd love for both of you to comment on this. First, Carrie, if you can speak to how long do you fund grantees? How many years? You had mentioned a 3-year grant and then a renewal. How do you decide when to stop funding an organization? These are questions that often come up in a multi-year context.
That's a really hard one. And then that's something that we wrestle with all of the time, because, in the best of all possible worlds, you do multi-year funding, you bring people in and you keep on funding them forever, but then that means that you run out of money and you aren't able to bring in new people. And so, so it's always that balance of doing that. So with Springboard, which are again younger organizations, we give them 2 years. They come in and it's a 2-year grant of general operating support. After the 2 years, many of them get an additional 3 years, but we're struggling with this. We're not totally transparent about that part because we don't, because a lot of the time the two-year organizations, they're great, they're good, and we've sort of set them on their way, and they might be in a place where they are able to access more funding because they're more sort of funder friendly than some of the other groups that might take a little bit more work on our part to dig in. So you know, there's a lot of nuance, there's a lot of reflection about whether we think that they'll be able to be taken up by other funders or other donors and what their prospects are, or whether they really need Durfee to continue to lean in. With some of our other programs, they aren't multi-year. So like the sabbatical program is not a multi-year program. It's a sabbatical award. We work with the organization. We continue to work with them after the sabbatical award because we always have, we run retreats and lunches, and we have this network of sabbatical leaders. So we continue to support them in that way. And that's forever. And we do have people who've been with us forever. They got a sabbatical award in the 90s and they're retired now, and they still come to the retreats, which is great.
And that's such a testament to the long-term relationship building that can extend beyond the kind of grant relationship. John, how do you approach multi-year grants at T. Rowe Price?
Yeah, so we, so the average length of time that our grantees are with us, you know, we have a new grants fund that allows us to kind of introduce it. You know, it's quasi similar to Springboard. They're on there for a couple of years, but then we onboard them potentially into our what we call effective citizenship portfolio. The average length of time, those are all multi-year grants, or unless a grantee has said, I want it to be a program grant, which that doesn't happen, but it very often, but it does, is around 12.5 years. So that's typically how long. We also have a number of different funds. So we have a capital fund, we have a new ventures fund, we have a number of, we have what we call a sugar sharing fund, which is to fund partnerships between groups. So a number of different funds. We also, you know, as part of our theory of philanthropy, part of that underneath work was to look at how you sunset organizations out of your portfolio, you know, and ways to do that. We went around the country and kind of looked at what other groups have done, and we realized there wasn't a lot of sunsetting strategies out there. So we developed our own, and so we have a formal sunsetting strategy in which we identify an organization that may not be 100% fit with any of our pools, and we offboard them over a couple of year process using our social capital, using our specific capacity building areas and a number of different things. Our capacity building program, if organizations took full advantage of it, would be the equivalent of a $25,000 to $40,000 grant. So we use a variety of those things. Organizations don't have to be a grantee of ours to get capacity building services. So we have a formal offboarding process that we use to help grantees on there. So we have a formal way to bring them on. They can be with us for over 10 to, you know, around 10 to 15 years. And then for groups that we're going to offboard, we have a formal process to sunset them.
Thank you. There's so much in there. I think one thing I'd like to emphasize here is the importance of transparency of process. So especially in a multi-year relationship, we've gotten this question before, like, what if you're not sure you're going to renew, or what if that renewal is not going to happen? Just giving those nonprofit leaders time to prepare so that they're not caught off guard, or they're not assuming they're going to get a renewal. So the communication is key. Sometimes that means having an awkward or uncomfortable conversation, but that is so much better than a nonprofit feeling like they have the rug pulled out from under them when they don't get a renewal and they were expecting a renewal. So the communication and the lead time are really important elements of this. And then this question is also coming up about, is it possible to do trust-based philanthropy when you don't accept unsolicited proposals? The answer again is yes. And as long as you are super transparent about your process, how decisions are made, what the criteria are, and offer some kind of way for an organization to get on your radar that may not be on your radar. So there's ways to do it. I'd love to point you again to the Trust-Based Philanthropy website. We have a lot of stories and examples of how these practices are embodied by different foundations. We have templates, as I mentioned, and examples of what other funders are doing. So we invite you to check that out, because again, there's not one way to do this. And thank you for Caitlin, just popped the link to in the chat so you can check that out. We are now at 25 after, so I'm going to hand it back to Aditi to take us on from here. Thank you so much to John and Carrie. Thank you for sharing your stories and your wisdom.
Thank you.
Thank you so much to John, Carrie, and Shadi. This was such an incredible conversation. Hi all, my name is Aditi. I joined SIF as the Social Justice Philanthropy Fellow just 3 weeks ago, and I'm so thrilled to learn more and execute further programming about trust-based philanthropy. First, you will see a link in the chat to a very short 2-minute survey about today's event. Your feedback is really important to us and will help inform our future programming. Please click on the link so that you're able to fill it out as we leave the session. But before you all jump off today, I want to just give us 1 minute to reflect. Those of you who have been to our events in the past will be familiar with this slide, but I'll explain it briefly anyway. The goal for our funder education events at SIF is not only to share new information and perspectives, but also to encourage reflection on how we, alongside our funder community, can put these ideas into action. As stated on the slide, the head asks after today's event, what is one thing you're thinking? The heart asks, what is one thing you're feeling? And the feet ask, what is one thing you are excited about implementing? As an example, after today's conversation, I'm thinking about how best to communicate trust effectively between funders and grantees. I'm feeling thoughtful about the language we use to engage in trust-based funder-grantee relationships, particularly when it comes to stepping away from investment or metrics-focused language. And I'm really excited to implement further programming on this subject. I'd love to see y'all put your answers to this slide in the chat. You can answer just 1, 2, or even all 3 of these prompts. And with that, I'll turn it over to Carolyn to close us out. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Aditi. So we're going to take down that slide, and a big, big thank you to everyone for coming and learning alongside us today. I encourage you to go back to that self-assessment tool as a guide and a way to set concrete goals to move forward. Probably will have more value now that you've heard from Shadi and John and Carrie. I also want to say there are so many great questions in the chat, and Shadi kindly said she will be a resource. But I will tell you that I learned a ton on their website. They also have a listserv. Caitlin, I don't know if you have a link to that or and could drop that in, but they have a listserv, and folks could also speak to other folks practicing trust-based philanthropy there and get lots of questions answered there and sort of be engaged in an ongoing conversation. So I'm going to encourage you know, this project is really out there to help you. So I'm going to encourage folks to access it. We will send the recording along in the coming days. A lot of people have asked for the slides. We will send the slides as well. I'm going to ask you one more time to do that survey for us, to just let us know. It's literally 2 minutes. Some thoughts on this event today, and just gives us a better idea of how to manage our programming going forward. So finally, I want to appreciate the SIF team. I want to appreciate the Funder Education Advisory Council, and of course, Shadi, Carrie, and John for their time, expertise, but most importantly, your willingness to guide us all in strengthening our communities by strengthening our relationships and really learning how to build trust. So appreciate sort of the values focus, appreciate the tools, and appreciate the really concrete examples. Thanks everyone for joining us today. And